Hey everyone, we've had a couple requests for some different ways to create atmosphere and fog and clouds. So I'm going to demo a couple different versions. Playing here with putting down rubbing alcohol first and seeing how that works and then going over it, but it doesn't really change it very much. So I'm just going to go ahead and lay in some pretty saturated tones. Start blocking in sort of some colors for this Technicolor sky object that we're going to look at here. So I'm going to use a few different techniques, hopefully all things that you have, but if there's something in here you don't have, then hopefully one of the other techniques you do have the stuff for. So there's rubbing alcohol, I've got white colored pencil, I've got a rag, and also a blender marker at some different points, some palette blending, and a paintbrush. So those are the materials I'm using in this. Very quickly laying down some mixed colors, mixed things. We're not going to worry too much about getting the perfect amount of saturation or blending on this. We're just going to play with some different techniques you can use to get atmosphere. So the reason I'm making sure to use the same colors in this foreground mountain range is so when we're done you'll be able to see the difference in saturation, hopefully, from the techniques and how they affect the background ink versus the ones in the front, which we will not apply those techniques to. So building up layers of saturation, layers of shadow. I'm going to use a colored pencil in the background here when we move to that to start as kind of a resist or a preservation technique to get some beams of light in the side, and the colored pencil works really well as a resist if you play it really heavily, and it also tags in later with helping pick things up with rubbing alcohol. So if you do cover an area in white colored pencil, it's going to be easier to lift from it later. I also realize about when I picked that paper up there that I'm doing this on the wrong side of my paper. So I've got a more absorbent cardstock that I'm working on, and usually I work on the slick side, and by accident started this demo on the absorbent side, so I'm going to be fighting that this whole time too, but it's okay. So this sky has a lot of like pinks and peaches and kind of purpley gray clouds. There's the white colored pencil that I'm using to preserve these like downward beams of light, and also along the edge of the moon. Now underneath those clouds it has sort of a golden touch, so I'm going ahead and laying those down, much like doing wood grain or doing marble techniques. It's keeping some continuity of direction of how things go across and trying to introduce random movement also as you pull the clouds from one side to the other. So make sure you've got a source in front of you that you like the way it looks and that you're pulling from. So testing out, since I'm on the wrong side of the paper, doesn't work very well, but you can use see how your markers and your paper react to having just rubbing alcohol and a Q-tip and seeing if you can distribute it. I am doing some palette blending here. I talked with some of you about if you don't have a blending marker, you can totally do palette blending with just a paintbrush rubbing alcohol. And that's on like a slick piece of plastic over there that I'm applying the marker to, and then I'm using a paintbrush dipped in rubbing alcohol to pick it up and distribute it. Which is a nice way to get some very like soft washes and some softer colors, since a lot of my yellows are very saturated. So this is the effect if you do have a marker. You can get a little bit more of detail, you can get higher saturation level if you want in certain places and kind of blend out from it, but switching back to the paintbrush because it covers a larger area very nicely. Nice thing about working in rubbing alcohol versus water is that you're going to get a lot of coverage fast, and it's going to dry really fast, so you can pretty much do a wash over it and it's dry within seconds, right? So that's the nice thing about working with the inks versus switching back and forth to watercolor, which you can do, but you're going to have to wait till all the layers are incredibly dry in order to move forward, and they might change the pour of the paper, so the alcohol won't do that as much. So using a couple different blues, pale blues, to start building up the direction of these clouds, start tinting the sky more of a cool tone, layering it with the yellows, layering it with the purples. And as you've all found, the more you work over an area, the more it sort of bleeds and pixelates and blends. So stuff that looked really stark not too long ago is now starting to, just from being gone over a few times, lighten up and lift and blend together a little bit more. So I have this very saturated yellow, which is the closest in tone, but very much more saturated than I would want probably. And I'm going to use that kind of sparingly in a few areas to lay that color in. And I know I'm going to have to go over it, right, to blend it. Sort of a mid-tone here, a peachy tone to help catch how some of the light would bounce up and reflect onto haze, onto clouds, and then adding blues. So now I have a incredibly desaturated pale warm gray that has a little bit of a yellow to it. That I am using with pretty strong force on my chisel tip to blend everything, lay a flat layer down, and choosing the direction of my heavier brush strokes to start really reactivating the layers underneath it and smudging them around so that they aren't so stiff. Adding more grays into these clouds, adding more dimension to them. Right now you can tell that there's a lot more saturation in the sky probably than I'm going to want, right? But I'm working with the markers that I have right now and working on getting them laid down in the colors that I want and knowing that I'm going to be able to back them up and kind of desaturate them in a little bit. Another pass with that really pale yellow gray. So now I've got a little bit more yellow blending that I'm going to use with the rubbing alcohol and a mixing palette of the same yellow that I used Drawn In to start blending out those edges of those areas. I laid it in and I was like, oh, that's super saturated. So this is like the blending midtones. Since I don't have a yellow that will do that, I'm using a mixing brush and a rubbing alcohol. And you can see that it just gets a lot softer, a lot more desaturated. Also, the pure rubbing alcohol lifts the things around it a lot more, right? Adding in some of those peaches, those bounced colors. Now I'm going to start deepening the actual clouds themselves. So we've got sort of their highlights and we have their shadows, but now we need to add sort of the shape of them with the midtones. So I have a blue that's way too dark and I have a blue that's so light you can barely see it, and this sort of medium, rather bright kind of baby blue, mixing all of them, bouncing back and forth, trying to find, you know, smoother, more rounded edges. Medium cool gray that I'm going through and using to bump some of our shadows up to give it more of a shape. Also has a brush tip, which is helpful in getting that more organic edge. So this is that pale color, which the Prismacolors in particular, I find the pale colors are even better at blending than their blending marker, which I could not explain. But it does a really good job of activating the layers underneath it and sort of leaching out the color a little bit, which is why I always return to it when I'm working. So if you find a marker in your kit that does that well, just consistently, then make a mental note, because even if it isn't a match maybe for the tones you're working with, it might be useful to use in other things. So this is the very pale blue. It's almost like maybe 5. So now I'm taking that white colored pencil and going in and softening a lot of my blended areas, right? So this is one technique you can do. You can use the colored pencil like crazy, you could use a pastel, you could use white gouache, you could use all sorts of things to sort of go over this and add a lightness and change the amount of saturation between this and its surrounding areas, especially if they're in similar tones. That's a great way to sort of differentiate my foreground and my background, right? Over here I'm using it very heavily in a vertical to kind of establish those bars of light coming down. On the other side, where it's more of a wispy cloud example, I'm using it more in kind of round little squiggle movements. So another great technique you can do, if you remember we laid that white colored pencil down first, but this will work whether or not white colored pencils come down, you'll see two different versions of it, is to put a bunch of rubbing alcohol down and then pick it up either with a rag or a paper towel, and it picks up very well. If there was anywhere you drew with a white colored pencil, it picks up off of that incredibly well, straight back to white. So that's one thing you can do. Now we've got some really nice like shot through angles of that white light. And I also used it over on the other side there and just sort of scrubbed with the rag, and it pixelated it and raised the level of the saturation until like you could go in there several times. You could make things almost disappear with rubbing alcohol and a rag. So I like to pour it and then very quickly apply the rag to soak it up. Rubbing alcohol does dry really quickly, so if you apply it with a brush, you have a little bit more control, but it does pool, and then you're going to pick it up, but it continues working long after. You can see over here, it's been a minute, now it's finally dry, that area has totally like pixelated out in the side and lost a lot of its edges, it's lost a lot of saturation, it has a much more atmospheric effect. So if you have straight rubbing alcohol or straight blending fluid, that's a great way to pull that out. If I were doing it in colored pencil, right, I'd do all the layers and then I'd just do the burnishing in white, and it would be totally different than where it was not burnished in white. But for this, since it's a little bit more concrete using these sort of chemical blenders, I'm using a white gel pen to pop a few different highlights to really define the areas of different sections of the cloud that are getting reflected light bounce back at them, and adding in just a couple more shadow places in it because it pulled up everything and made it feel a little bit the same all over. So it sort of flattened all my saturation to one level, left the colors, but pulled some of my saturation. So using a medium gray to sort of add in some of those more defining shadows, soft areas. So that's a couple different ways you can do that, right? So you can either lay down the white with the colored pencil in advance, use it as a resist. You can lay down a colored pencil on top of it when it's done, but you're not going to get as strong of a result. If you lay down the white in advance, you can use rubbing alcohol to pull it back up all the way to white. And if you didn't, you can use rubbing alcohol and a rag to very carefully remove and lower your saturation. I could keep doing it over and over again, and I could really drop that saturation like crazy. So that is 3 different methods.